I was recently talking to a colleague who couldn't stop obsessing over a single recurring question. He leaned in, almost frustrated, and asked, with all that oil, how is it even possible for Venezuela to look like this? To him, it was a glitch in the universe, a moral math problem that didn't add up. He spoke about the country as if it were a disgraced lottery winner who had simply gambled away a fortune, convinced that if you just swapped the leadership for someone more Western-friendly, the wealth would instantly start trickling down to the streets of Caracas. He showed me a graph on his phone. Production numbers plummeting, inflation spiking. It's a failed state, he said, with that certain kind of pity that feels a bit like judgment. To him, the oil was a gift that had been squandered by bad actors. But then I asked him about the 1980s, the era before the current headlines, when the oil was still flowing under stable leadership, yet the country was already fracturing under a debt crisis that eventually led to the military firing on its own citizens. His expression shifted. He didn't want to talk about the deep structure of the engine, only the person currently behind the wheel. That's the great illusion we're often sold. We're taught to see oil as a shortcut to prosperity. But for Venezuela, it has always been more of a golden chain. It's a trap where the state doesn't live off the productivity of its people, but off the volatility of a single resource making. The nation not rich, but profoundly dependent. When you look past the slogans, you realize the international obsession with Venezuela isn't actually about a moral crusade for democracy. It's about a strategic struggle for obedience. The real problem for the global powers isn't that Venezuela is in crisis. It's that its oil stopped being a docile resource and started being a tool for sovereignty.
That's a very heavy, very loaded place to start. And honestly, your colleague's reaction is the perfect entry point for what we're doing today.
Right.
Because that glitch in the universe feeling, that inability to reconcile the wealth of the geology with the poverty on the street, that is precisely where most people stop thinking. They see the glitch, they blame a bad guy, usually whoever is currently wearing the presidential sash, and they just move on.
It's the bad actor theory. It's simple. It's clean.
Yeah.
And it's comforting because it implies a simple fix. If the problem is just one guy or one administration, then the solution is just to, fire them and hire someone else. Like changing a manager at a failing restaurant.
Exactly. But what if the restaurant itself is built on a sinkhole? What if the plumbing was installed backward 40 years ago? What if the foundation is just fundamentally rotten?
That's what we're looking at today.
We're trying to understand Venezuela not as a crime scene of the last 10 or 20 years, but as a structural tragedy that has been unfolding for decades. We are trying to move beyond the headlines to look at the actual mechanics of the state itself.
And we have a massive stack of sources to help us do that.
Yeah.
This isn't just opinion. We're digging into some pretty dense academic and economic work.
We are. We've got Jana Morgan's research on party system collapse, which is just essential for understanding why the democracy broke long before the current regime even took power.
Right.
We've got Paul Collier's Political Economy of Natural Resources, which effectively gives us the physics of the resource curse. We have UNDP reports on the inequality trap in Latin America.
And maybe most importantly, to ground all this theory, we have personal testimonies.
Yeah.
We're going to be hearing the voices of people we'll call Alejandro, Elena, and Miguel, who actually lived through these different eras.
Yeah, that's crucial, the human element.
So the mission here really is to dismantle that moral math problem my colleague had. We're going to look at four main pillars: the resource curse itself, which is so much more complicated than just having oil is bad.
So much more.
Then the collapse of the traditional party system, the slow, painful dismantling of meritocracy, and this really fascinating, slightly disturbing concept called the therapeutic state.
And to do that, we have to start with the illusion. We have to start with the memory that makes the current reality so incredibly painful for so many. We need to talk about the era of Saudi Venezuela.
This is a phrase that kept popping up in the reading. Saudi Venezuela. It refers to the 1970s. And I want to bring in our first personal account here, Alejandro. He was a mid-level administrator in Caracas during that time. And reading his account, it really feels like he's describing a completely different civilization.
I mean, in a way he is. The 1970s were the boom years. The oil price quadrupled in 73, 74 because of the OPEC embargo and all the geopolitical conflict in the Middle East. And just suddenly, Venezuela was awash in petrodollars.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of influx of cash.
It's like a national lottery win.
And Alejandro talks about the psychology of that time. He mentions that for a middle-class family, it was actually cheaper to fly to Miami for a weekend shopping trip than it was to drive to a Venezuelan beach and stay in a hotel.
Yeah, there was a phrase they used in Miami for Venezuelan tourists: Tá barato, dame dos.
Which means
cheap, give me two.
is cheap, give me two. I mean, just imagine the mindset that creates. You walk into a store in the United States, which is supposed to be the wealthiest country on earth, and you feel rich. You feel like the currency in your pocket is just stronger than theirs.
You feel like you've made it.
Yeah. And Alejandro says they believed this was permanent. They thought the institutions, the democracy, the pension funds, the public works, the universities, they thought they were all made of granite.
And that belief, that sense of permanence, that is the golden illusion. And to understand why it was an illusion, we have to introduce a core concept from our sources, the Rentier State.
Okay, let's pause on this, because I see this term Rentier State in political science papers all the time, and I think most people's eyes just glaze over. It sounds like it has something to do with renting apartments, but in this context, it's vastly different.
Completely different. Rent in economics refers to income derived from ownership of a resource rather than from actual labor or innovation or productivity. So let's look at a normal state, let's say Germany or Japan. How does the government get money to survive?
Taxes. They tax the income of their citizens and the profits of their corporations.
Exactly. And that creates a very specific relationship. The government needs you. It needs you to be educated, to be healthy, to be employed, because if you aren't making money, they aren't making money. You are the engine of the state.
It's a partnership. A forced partnership, maybe, but a partnership nonetheless. And because I pay taxes, I feel like I have the right to yell at them when the roads are bad.
That is the fiscal contract. No taxation without representation, but also no representation without taxation. Now, flip the switch to a rentier state like Venezuela. The government sits on top of the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world. It extracts that oil and sells it to the international market.
So the money comes straight from the ground, not from the people. The government's income stream is totally separate from the people's productivity.
The government has an ATM in the geology. It doesn't strictly need its citizens to be productive to fund its budget. It just needs the oil price to stay high.
That changes the citizen from being an asset to
But what?
a cost center.
At best, a dependent. At worst, a liability you have to manage. The source material describes this as the golden chain. It sounds like a gift, but it's a trap. Because when the state is independent of its citizens' productivity, it becomes profoundly dependent on global market volatility.
Which it has zero control over.
Zero. So when oil is high, like in Alejandro's 1970s, you have social peace. The government can just shower the people with subsidies. Gasoline becomes cheaper than water. Almost no one pays income tax. It feels like paradise.
But it's an artificial paradise. It's a paradise that's being rented from the global commodities market.
And the lease eventually expires. Alejandro saw this firsthand in the 1980s. The oil price crashed. The debt crisis hit. And just boom, the Saudi of Venezuela vanished.
And what did that look like on the ground for him as an administrator?
He describes watching his professional standards just evaporate. He talks about the infrastructure starting to rust, the subways, the bridges. It wasn't just that they had less money. It was that the state had never built the muscles of a productive economy.
Because it never had to. This is the Plan B problem we talked about. When the oil crashes, you look around for your other industries, your agriculture, your manufacturing, your tech sector, and you realize they're gone.
Or they were never really there in the first place. They were never developed. And socially, because the state never had to negotiate with its citizens for taxes, because it never had to go to the people and say, please give me 20% of your paycheck so we can build a school. It never built deep, resilient ties of accountability. It just bought loyalty. And when the money runs out, you can't buy loyalty anymore.
So the social contract wasn't a contract based on mutual obligation. It was a transaction. It was, I'll give you cheap gas and subsidized housing, and you stay quiet and don't ask too many questions.
And when the gas isn't cheap anymore, the silence ends. Which brings us directly to the political collapse. Because, and this is key, Venezuela wasn't a dictatorship during this time. It was a celebrated democracy. It had a two-party system that, from the outside, looked incredibly stable.
Right. This is section 2 of our deep dive. We're looking at Jana Morgan's research here on the collapse of that party system. And this part is fascinating because on paper, Venezuela from 1958 to, say, 1998 looked like the model student of Latin America, the Punto Fijo era.
It absolutely was. You had two main parties, Action Democratico, or AD, which was sort of center-left, and COPEI, which was center-right Christian Democratic. They alternated power peacefully. They didn't kill each other. In a region that was just rife with military coups and dictatorships, Venezuela was the exception.
So what happened? Why did it implode? If everyone was getting along and the system seemed to be working, how do you go from that stability to a total violent rejection of the entire system?
Morgan introduces a concept she calls linkage strategies. This is a bit technical, so let's break it down. Think of a political party as a bridge. Its whole function is to link the government to the population.
Okay, so the party is the mechanism that takes the needs and wants of the people and is supposed to translate them into policy.
Exactly. In that Punto Fijo era, these two parties built very strong bridges to two very specific groups: organized labor unions and business associations. This is what we call the formal sector. If you had a contract, a pension, and a suit, the party was listening to you.
You were inside the club, you had a seat at the table.
You were inside the club. But starting in the 1980s, during that economic crash that Alejandro lived through, the economy started to fundamentally change its structure. The informal sector just exploded.
We need to define that. Informal sector sounds like people doing casual work, but in a Latin American context, it's so much bigger than that, isn't it?
It's massive. It's the street vendors, the day laborers, the motorcycle taxi drivers, the domestic workers paid in cash. These are people who don't have contracts, they don't pay taxes, and they're not in a union. By the 1990s, this was nearly half the entire workforce.
Half the country. So
Yeah.
you have 50% of the population standing outside the club, looking in through the window.
And the parties did not build a bridge to them. Morgan's research shows that the parties just kept using their old strategies, talking to the union bosses and the Chamber of Commerce presidents, while millions and millions of Venezuelans were sliding into poverty and had absolutely no political representation. They were invisible.
That creates a massive representation gap. You have half the country feeling like ghosts in their own democracy. The data from the sources is pretty stark on this. Party identification, which was over 70% in the 70s, plummets to under 20% by the 90s.
A total collapse of faith. But it gets even worse. Morgan points out what she calls a programmatic failure. When the debt crisis hit in the late 80s, the government, this stable democracy, had to implement really harsh austerity measures to satisfy the IMF and the international banks.
Neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus.
Exactly. Spending cuts, privatization, raising the price of public services. But here's the kicker. Both of the main parties agreed on this, AD and COPI. They both said this is the only way.
So if I'm a voter and I'm hurting and I want an alternative to these cuts,
I have nowhere to go. You go to the ballot box, and option A says we need painful austerity, and option B says we also need painful austerity. The parties completely converged ideologically. They left the voters with no meaningful choice at all.
and that frustration had to go somewhere.
And it boiled over in February 1989 with the Caracazo.
This is the turning point. This wasn't a protest, it wasn't a riot. It was described as a social explosion.
It was. The government raised gasoline prices, part of that IMF austerity package, and the poor, the informal sector, the people who had been ignored by the linkage strategies for a decade, they came down from the barrios in the hills surrounding Caracas and they burned the city. They looted. It was raw, unorganized rage against the system.
And the government's response, the response of this stable, respected democracy.
They sent the army, and the army fired on its own people. Thousands died. The official numbers are much lower, but every testimony, every historical account suggests thousands were killed in the streets. And that single moment just broke the moral legitimacy of the democracy.
That's the moment the mask falls off. You can't call yourself a democracy of the people if you shoot the people for complaining about the price of bread and bus tickets.
You just can't. And the source material is adamant about this. The rise of Hugo Chavez didn't happen in a vacuum. He wasn't some wizard who came from nowhere and hypnotized a happy, functioning country.
No, he stepped into a vacuum that the traditional parties themselves had created. The rejection wasn't just of the ruling party, it was a rejection of the entire system.
The whole club.
So when Chavez shows up a few years later with his coup attempt and then his presidential campaign saying the system is rotten, the elites are robbing you, he wasn't saying something radical to these people. He was just stating the obvious facts of their lives.
He was the brick through the window. He was the ultimate outsider. And he wasn't originally supported because he was a socialist or communist. He was supported because he was the only one who's even acknowledging that the Punto Fijo Club was closed to half the country.
Okay, so we have the economic setup, the unstable foundation of the Rentier State. We have the political setup, the collapse of the parties that were supposed to manage it. Now I want to get into the deep mechanics of why oil makes politics so uniquely toxic. We're turning to Paul Collier's work here, his analysis on the political economy of natural resources.
Collier is brilliant at this. He just strips away all the romance and the ideology and looks at the raw incentives. We've already touched on the economic side, the Dutch disease.
Right. And I want to make sure we really nail that concept because we hear it a lot. Dutch disease, it sounds like a flu. But mechanistically, how does it actually kill a country's economy?
Okay, so let's do a quick thought experiment. Imagine you are a corn farmer in Venezuela in the 1970s.
Okay, I'm growing corn. It's a tough job, but I'm doing it.
Suddenly, the country strikes it rich with this massive oil boom. Billions and billions of dollars flood into the national treasury. Now, to spend that money locally, to pay for government salaries for construction projects, the state has to convert those dollars into bolivars, the local currency.
Okay.
This massive, overwhelming demand for the bolivar makes the currency incredibly strong. Your exchange rate goes through the roof.
My money is worth a lot internationally. That sounds good, doesn't it?
It's great if you're an importer. It's great if you want to buy a new TV from Japan. But it's terrible if you're our corn farmer trying to sell corn. Because your currency is so strong, foreign corn from the US or Brazil, where the currency isn't as inflated, becomes incredibly cheap to import. It becomes cheaper for a supermarket in Caracas to buy imported corn than to pay you to grow it.
So I can't compete. My business model is destroyed. I go out of business.
Exactly. The oil wealth makes every other tradable sector, agriculture, manufacturing, textiles, you name it, uncompetitive. They wither and die. So the country stops making things and starts importing everything.
Which makes you even more dependent on the oil to pay for all those imports. It's a vicious cycle.
A death spiral for the productive economy. But Collier argues that the political Dutch disease is even deadlier. We've talked about the broken tax link, that no representation without taxation idea, but he also talks about the erosion of checks and balances.
How does oil erode checks and balances like, say, an independent judiciary or a free press?
Through patronage, pure and simple. If you are a prime minister in a poor country with no resources, you have to govern by consensus. You have to negotiate with different factions. You have to build coalitions. You have to persuade people.
You have to actually govern.
You have to govern. But if you are a president sitting on $1 trillion of oil revenue, you don't need to negotiate. You can buy the loyalty of the generals with new tanks. You can buy the loyalty of the judges with bigger salaries. You can buy the loyalty of the media with state advertising. You can buy the loyalty of the voters with subsidies.
You substitute bribery for governance.
Effectively. And Collier introduces another really sharp concept called time inconsistency. This is basically the eat the seed corn problem.
Okay.
If you are a leader in a volatile state and you know you might be ousted in the next election or the next coup, do you take that oil money and save it for the future? Do you invest it in a sovereign wealth fund like Norway did for 20 years from now?
No, absolutely not. I might not be here in 20 years. I need to survive today. I need to win the next election, which is in 2 years.
Exactly. The rational political move is to extract the resources as fast as possible and spend the money immediately to buy short-term support. Spend it on consumption, giving people cheap TVs and bags of food rather than on long-term investment like education or research and development.
It's a national sugar rush. You feel great for an hour, and then you crash hard.
And that leads directly to this high inequality, low growth trap that the UNDP report talks about. The elites, both economic and political, capture the state to get access to the oil rents. They stop trying to build innovative businesses and start trying to build political connections. Why invent a better mousetrap when you can just get a government contract to supply old, expensive mousetraps at triple the price?
The entire productivity of the nation just dies because the incentive structure is completely warped, and the people know it. The source data on the perception of unfairness is staggering. Latin Americans, and Venezuelans specifically, overwhelmingly perceive their societies as being governed by a few powerful groups for their own benefit.
And if you believe the game is fundamentally rigged, you don't play by the rules anymore. You try to flip the whole board over. Which brings us to the next casualty of this entire process, meritocracy.
This is section 4, and this is where the story gets really personal and, frankly, tragic for a lot of professionals.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Elena. She was an engineer at the old PDVSA, the state oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela.
We have to understand what PDVSA used to be. Before all of this, before the crisis, it was widely considered the second best run national oil company in the entire world, right after Saudi Aramco. It was a genuine meritocracy.
It was the crown jewel.
It was, and Elena describes the culture there. Rigorous entrance exams, constant training, international scholarships to the best universities. You didn't get promoted because you knew a politician. You got promoted because you were a brilliant geologist or a world-class chemical engineer.
It was a state within a state.
Yeah.
It was the one part of the system that actually worked perfectly.
Until the early 2000s, there was a massive political conflict between the new Chavez government and the existing PDVSA management. The technocrats at PDVSA saw the government trying to use the company's profits for political projects and saw it as a politicization of their institution. They went on strike.
And the government's reaction was dramatic, to say the least.
It was a purge, a televised purge. Alina describes watching on live television as the president stood on a stage, held up a whistle, blew it, and proceeded to read out the names of employees being fired. He fired 18,000 employees.
18,000. And we need to be clear, these aren't just, paper pushers. These are nuclear physicists, chemical engineers, deep-sea drillers, the people with 30 years of institutional memory.
The brain drain was instantaneous and catastrophic. The human capital, the collective intelligence that knew how to run this incredibly complex machinery was exiled overnight, and they were replaced by political loyalists, people who wore the right color shirt but didn't necessarily know how to maintain a catalytic cracker or manage a deep-water oil field.
And my colleague, who was asking about the production numbers plummeting, well, this is the answer. It's not just that the price of oil fell, it's that the machine itself broke.
And the people who knew how to fix it were driving taxis in Houston or running bakeries in Madrid. But Jana Morgan connects this very specific event to a broader, more dangerous concept called institutional polarization.
Okay, how is that different from regular polarization? I mean, we have polarization in the US and Europe. We argue about taxes. We argue about healthcare.
Right, but that's what Morgan calls ideological polarization. We disagree on policy, but we generally agree on the rules of the game. We agree that elections are legitimate, that courts should be independent, and so on.
We're playing the same sport, just on different teams.
Exactly. Institutional polarization is when we stop agreeing on the rules of the game. It's when the conflict shifts from left versus right to democracy versus authoritarianism, or the will of the people versus the traitorous elites.
It becomes existential. The other side isn't just wrong. They're an enemy.
Yes. And when you view the other side not as a legitimate opponent, but as a threat to the nation's very existence, you stop respecting institutions. You weaponize the courts. You pack the Supreme Court. You weaponize the civil service. You purge the traitors from the national oil company.
And meritocracy cannot survive in an environment of institutional polarization.
Impossible. Because competence becomes less important than loyalty. Your skills are secondary to your slogans.
So, we've dismantled the economy with the resource curse. We've dismantled the political system by creating a representation vacuum, and we've dismantled the competence of the state by destroying meritocracy. But we have to talk about what replaced it, because for a while, for a lot of people, the new system actually felt good, felt like care. This brings us to the therapeutic state.
This is such a crucial and subtle concept. To understand it, let's look at Miguel, our source, who was a grandfather living in a Caracas barrio. For him, the collapse of the old Punto Fio system wasn't a tragedy at all. It was a relief.
He didn't mourn it.
Not for a second. He talks about the miracle years of the early 2000s and into the early 2010s.
The misiones.
The missions.
The missions. These were parallel social programs funded directly by the oil windfall. You had Barrios Adentro, which brought Cuban doctors into health clinics in the slums for the first time. You had Merkel, which provided bags of heavily subsidized food. Miguel describes the feeling of a doctor knocking on his door to ask if his family was okay.
He used the word dignity. He said for the first time in his life, the state saw him. He felt visible.
And that is the therapeutic aspect. The state stopped acting like a distant bureaucratic administrator, someone who just paves roads and processes paperwork, and it started acting like a therapist or a provider. Its primary goal became healing the wounds of inequality and exclusion.
I mean, that sounds noble. On the surface, it sounds like what a government should be doing for its most vulnerable citizens. It is absolutely noble in its intent. But structurally, it was a disaster because it created a relationship of pure, unmediated dependency. The citizen becomes a patient, and the patient relies entirely on the doctor for survival.
And the medicine, the free clinics, the food bags, was paid for with the oil money.
Exactly. It wasn't paid for by a sustainable, productive local economy. It was just a cash transfer from the oil fields. So Miguel didn't need a job in a factory, which, remember, didn't exist anymore because of Dutch disease. He just needed the state to keep the oil flowing and the food bags coming to his door.
And then the oil crashed. Again, hard.
And the therapy stopped. This is the betrayal that Miguel describes. When the price of oil collapsed in 2014, the doctor ran out of medicine. The clinics closed because they couldn't pay the Cuban doctors anymore. The food bags got smaller, and then they stopped coming regularly.
But the underlying problem hadn't been fixed.
It had been made worse. Because the local economy had been actively destroyed by years of price controls and expropriations, Miguel couldn't just go to the local market and buy food. The store was empty. The farms weren't producing.
He was trapped. He had lost the ability to survive independently because the state had made him dependent, and then the state abandoned him.
And this marks the fundamental shift from the Chavez era to the Maduro era. The Chavez era, for all its flaws, was characterized by high oil prices and a genuine, if unsustainable, project of social inclusion. It seemed to work as long as the money poured in. The Maduro era is characterized by the crash. It shifts from inclusion to pure survival.
There was that chilling line in one of the sources we read saying the state stopped being socialist in any meaningful sense.
Right. It called it a rentier state in survival mode. The government stopped trying to uplift the poor and started focusing entirely on just staying in power. Since they couldn't buy loyalty with cash and subsidies anymore, they had to secure it with force and control. They used opacity, hiding the inflation data, hiding the health statistics. They used repression.
So the therapeutic state becomes a police state. But the patient is still sick.
Sicker than ever. Which brings us to the final section, the human toll. We can talk about GDP and inflation percentages all day, but we need to talk about what hyperinflation actually does to the human mind. We have a source here from Al Jazeera that looks at the mental health crisis in similar economic collapses, like in Argentina.
It's economic anxiety on steroids. It's a different category of stress.
It's the death of the future. When you have stable money, you can plan. You can say, I will save for 5 years to buy a house, or I will study for 4 years to get a degree. When you have hyperinflation, when prices are doubling every few weeks, you can only think about today, this hour.
Will the money that's in my pocket right now still be able to buy eggs by the time I get to the market? That's the only calculation that matters.
Exactly. It completely shrinks your temporal horizon. You live in a permanent state of fight or flight. The psychologists in the report talk about chronic sleep deprivation, panic attacks, a sense of constant negative rumination. You are always calculating, always worrying. It completely exhausts the mind.
And the UNDP report highlights the profound inequality of suffering.
This is so important. The crisis doesn't hit everyone equally. If you have dollars in a Miami bank account, you're fine. You might even benefit because your dollars buy more and more in the local economy. But the indigenous groups, the homeless, the people like Miguel in the informal sector, they take the full force of the blow. They have no shield, no savings, nothing.
And out of that, we see the absolute tragedy of the lost generation.
Education just loses its value. If a university professor with a PhD earns the equivalent of $10 a month and a kid running illicit errands for a criminal game can earn $100 a week, the entire incentive structure of society collapses. Why study? Why build skills?
Why plan for a future that doesn't exist?
Right. The trap locks in. You end up with a generation that is undereducated, often malnourished, and deeply traumatized by years of instability and violence.
It's incredibly heavy, but it does bring us back full circle to my colleague and his simple question, his glitch.
And I think now we can see that it's not a glitch at all. Venezuela isn't poor despite the oil. In so many ways, it is poor because of how the oil was used to mask all of this structural rot for decades.
The oil allowed them to ignore the need for a real tax system. It allowed the political parties to ignore the need for genuine representation for half the country. It actively funded the destruction of all the other industries. It paid for the dismantling of meritocracy in the state's most important company.
And in the end, it created a therapeutic dependency that left millions of people helpless when the market inevitably turned against them. The verdict is structural. Venezuela didn't collapse just because of bad politics or one bad leader. It collapsed because the foundation, the Rentier State model, was flawed from the very beginning.
Which means the solution isn't as simple as just have an election and bring in a Western-friendly leader.
That is the false solution.
Yeah.
That's the illusion my colleague was under. If you simply swap the president, but you don't fix the underlying engine, if you don't diversify the economy, if you don't build a real tax base that forces the government to be accountable to the people, if you don't painstakingly rebuild meritocracy and trust in institutions, you are just resetting the clock.
You're just waiting for the next oil boom to hide the problems.
And the next bust to reveal them all over again.
It goes right back to that image of the golden chain.
And I want to leave you with that final thought from the source material regarding the international dimension of all this. The struggle we see, the sanctions, the geopolitics, the international posturing, it isn't just about democracy in the abstract. It's about the role of that oil.
Whether it's a tool for national sovereignty or just a docile resource for the global market.
For the global powers, the ideal is a docile resource. They want certainty, they want stability, they want the oil to flow predictably. But for many people in Venezuela, for Alejandro, for Elena, for Miguel, the oil was supposed to be their shield. It was supposed to be their ticket to sovereignty and prosperity. Instead, it became the weapon that was used to dismantle their entire society from the inside out.
And the ultimate tragedy is that they're the ones caught in the middle. The oil companies will survive, the foreign governments will move on. But the people paying the real price are the ones living through the hyperinflation, the hunger, and the theft of their future.
That's the human cost of the structural failure.
And that is where we have to leave it. Not with a clean answer, but with a much deeper, much more troubling understanding of the question. We look at a map, we see a country, but underneath we see the gears of history grinding against the fragility of human hope. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
It was a pleasure. Let's keep looking beneath the surface.